Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today's deep dive into the source material takes us into a realm that honestly makes a lot of modern people incredibly uncomfortable.
Oh, without a doubt. It is definitely not a safe or easy topic by any means.
No, it's really not, because, normally when we talk about a diagnosis, there is this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, like looking at an X-ray or some kind of scan.
Spot on. Think about engineering or orthopedics. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there's the problem.
It's visible. It's totally objective.
Yeah, and oddly enough, it's comforting. I mean, we like things to be visible, right? To be neatly categorized, to be solvable with a physical splint or a straightforward surgery.
We want a physical fix for a physical problem.
But then you step into the realm of the human heart, into the spiritual condition of humanity, and suddenly that clinical x-ray machine just shatters.
Yeah, it completely falls apart. You can't put the soul on an operating table.
No, you can't. We look at the diagnostic landscape of the human soul, and it is entirely murky. We try to treat behavioral symptoms without ever identifying the root disease.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, modern therapeutic methods often attempt to put this superficial bandage on a condition that actually requires a total systemic transplant.
Right. We want a quick fix.
Exactly. We try to medicate the symptoms of human depravity rather than addressing the core hardware malfunction of the soul.
Which is the core mission of our deep dive today. And I'm really glad you're sitting with us as the third person at this table, because we are going to look at a text that completely shatters that murky therapeutic landscape.
We are digging into some heavy theology today.
We really are. We are analyzing two extensive, rigorous theological expositions of Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 14.
Which is such a brilliant, intense passage of Scripture.
It is. We're stripping away the modern psychological jargon to examine what it actually means to put sin to death, and conversely, what it means to put on the character of Christ.
And we have to be clear up front. The Apostle Paul does not offer a gentle self-help remedy in this text.
No, he really doesn't pull his punches.
Not at all. He offers a decisive, surgical strike against the natural inclinations of the human heart. It is violent, it is uncompromising, and it is entirely countercultural.
The contrast presented in these sources is just stark. I mean, think about the cultural mantra we hear every single day in advertisements, in movies, and, across social media.
It's everywhere.
It is always some variation of express yourself, follow your heart, validate your internal desires.
Right, the idea that your truth is found by looking inward.
Spot on. But the sources point out that Christ issues a command that stands in direct opposition to that entire worldview. Christ says, deny yourself.
Which is the exact opposite of expressing yourself.
Yeah. This text we are looking at is not about behavior modification, like trying to eat fewer carbs or waking up an hour earlier. It is about a radical shift in the category of humanity you belong to.
But before we can even evaluate the specific commands given to this ancient church, we have to look at the specific people receiving those commands, right?
Context is everything.
Right, and the historical situation they faced. Context dictates meaning, and the context of the Lycus River Valley in the first century provides the background for why these commands are so urgent. We are talking about the city of Colossae.
Let me stop you there, because honestly, geographical context is usually where eyes start to glaze over.
Fair enough, yeah. History can feel a bit dry.
Right. So why should someone living in the 21st century care about the economy or the geography of an ancient city in Asia Minor? Paint the picture of the city for us. What was the lived reality for a normal person waking up in Colossae?
Okay, so we are looking at the Lycus River Valley in Phrygia. That's part of the Roman province of Asia Minor, which aligns with modern-day Turkey.
Okay, got it.
It sits roughly 100 miles east of Ephesus. Now, if you rewind the clock a few centuries before this letter was written, Colossae had been a major, thriving metropolis.
So it was a big deal back in the day.
Huge! It sat right on a major trade route. It was wealthy, bustling, and famous for a very specific industry, which was a lucrative wool trade.
Wool, like making clothes and textiles.
Yeah, specifically, they produced a highly sought-after dark red wool known as colossinum. The dye used to make this wool was extracted from local resources, and it created this luxury garment that was traded all over the known world.
So it was a city built on commerce, luxury goods, and I imagine a massive influx of foreign wealth.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds like a first-century equivalent of a modern fashion or tech hub, where the entire local economy is propped up by one massive industry.
Originally, yes. But economies shift, right? Trade routes change.
They always do.
Right. So by the time the Apostle Paul's writing this letter, which is around AD 60 to 62, the city had experienced a severe economic decline.
Oh, wow. So the boom was over?
Completely. The neighboring cities of Laodicea and Hierapolis had grown massively, and they kind of siphoned off the trade and the wealth. Colossae was no longer the regional titan it once was.
So it became sort of a secondary town.
Yeah. It was a community of households, tradesmen. There was a large population of transplanted Jews, Greek Gentiles, slaves, masters. Just a real mix.
And they're all living under this heavy, suffocating pressure of Greco-Roman pagan culture, I assume?
Yes, while also dealing with the economic insecurity of living in a city that was way past its prime.
And what fascinates me about this specific letter is that Paul did not even plant this church. I mean, he had never even visited them.
Right, the sources indicate the church was planted by Epaphras.
Epaphras.
Yeah. He was a native Colossian who had traveled down to Ephesus during the years Paul was preaching there. Epaphras heard the gospel, he was converted, and he took that message back up the valley to his hometown.
So he essentially evangelized his own neighbors?
Spot on. Fast forward a few years, and Epaphras visits Paul, who is, sitting in chains in a Roman prison. He goes to give him a report on how the congregation is doing.
So Paul is writing this letter from a state of total physical restriction.
Yeah, he is absent in body, but he carries this immense apostolic authority for this flock.
But Epaphras did not travel all the way to Rome just to bring a positive, upbeat update.
No, not at all. He brought news of a severe theological threat that was infiltrating the congregation.
The sources call it the Colossian heresy, right?
Yes, the Colossian heresy.
My understanding is that the early church usually faced external persecution, like, being thrown to lions or imprisoned, but this threat was entirely internal, what was spreading through the pews.
It was incredibly toxic syncretism. And syncretism occurs when you blend different, often opposing belief systems together into a new hybrid religion.
Like a spiritual buffet.
Yes, exactly. The false teachers infiltrating the Colossian house churches were mixing an early nascent form of Gnosticism, stringent Jewish legalism, and localized pagan mysticism.
Okay, I want to break each of those three ingredients down because mixing Gnosticism, Jewish law, and paganism sounds like an absolute theological train wreck.
It was a total mess.
Let's start with Gnosticism. How did that function in this local context?
So early Gnosticism operated on a strict dualism. They believed that all matter, the physical world, the human body, the dirt, the trees, was inherently evil.
Wait, all physical matter was evil?
Yes, everything physical. And conversely, they believed that all spirit was inherently good. Because they viewed the physical body as an evil prison, they taught that salvation was essentially an escape from the physical realm.
Okay, so how did they claim you could achieve this escape?
To achieve it, you needed a secret, elevated knowledge, which in Greek is called gnosis.
Ah, hence the name Gnosticism.
Right. They claimed the simple gospel of Christ, crucified and risen, was, well, fine for the uninitiated beginners.
Like a starter pack.
Exactly, a starter pack.
Yeah.
But to truly ascend to the spiritual heights, you needed their secret passwords, their elevated insight.
Okay, so that is the Gnostic element.
Yeah.
But how did the Jewish legalism factor in? Because you have Greeks talking about secret spiritual knowledge, but then you have people demanding strict adherence to ancient Hebrew calendars.
The false teachers argued that Christ alone was insufficient for spiritual fullness. They demanded that Gentile believers observe strict Jewish Sabbaths, new moon festivals, and stringent dietary laws.
The whole do not handle, do not taste, do not touch mentality.
Yes, they weaponized the Mosaic law not as a tutor to lead people to Christ, but as a rigid checklist to attain that secret gnosis.
And the third ingredient, the pagan mysticism.
This involved the worship of angels and severe bodily asceticism.
Asceticism meaning like denying the body.
Denying it, punishing it. Because they viewed the body as evil, they believed you had to starve it and abuse it to demonstrate your spiritual superiority.
Wow.
They also sought out visions and mystical experiences with angelic beings, basically bypassing Christ the mediator to interact directly with the spiritual realm.
So they offered a spirituality that looked incredibly rigorous and impressive on the outside, but it completely undermined the supremacy of Jesus.
100%. It looked holy, but it was spiritually bankrupt.
I am going to report impartially on what the sources claim here, because this is where the ancient history crashes violently into our modern context.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources argue that the modern church faces the identical threats today, just wearing different names. For instance, the sources draw a direct line from ancient asceticism to Roman Catholic practices of penance.
Right, the idea that physical actions can pay for spiritual debts.
Yes, the idea that you can subdue the flesh or pay for sin through physical acts, rituals, or self-denial. They also point to the New Apostolic Reformation, noting how that specific movement's pursuit of extra-biblical visions, angelic encounters, and new revelations directly mirrors the ancient Colossian pursuit of secret knowledge and mystical experiences.
It is a very similar pattern.
And they even call out pragmatic, seeker-sensitive church movements that offer a quote-unquote crossless Christianity. The sources are basically saying that avoiding the hard truths of human depravity to draw a massive crowd is just another way of saying Christ's actual unvarnished message is insufficient.
The authors are asserting that human nature has not changed an inch in 2,000 years.
Not one bit.
The core issue, whether in the 1st century or the 21st century, is the human inclination to add to the finished work of Christ. The false teachers in Colossae were imposing these exhausting rules on the physical body while leaving the internal diseases of pride, anger, and covetousness completely untouched.
Right, they offered a religious system that looked holy to the neighbors, but possessed no actual capacity to restrain the flesh.
None whatsoever.
You know, I look at the asceticism they practice, starving the body, engaging in severe physical disciplines to achieve a spiritual high, and I see a direct secular parallel today.
Oh, really? Like what?
Look at the extreme wellness trends dominating social media right now. People engage in extreme biohacking. They go on radical dopamine fasts. They sit in freezing ice baths for hours. They eliminate every conceivable impurity from their diet, and they fly across the world for silent retreats.
Oh, yeah, the whole optimization culture.
Exactly. Now, there's nothing wrong with being healthy, obviously, but the underlying motivation for many is a modern form of asceticism. They are hyper-regulating the physical body to cure an internal spiritual anxiety.
They're trying to cure the soul with a physical routine.
Yes. So let me play devil's advocate here. From a psychological standpoint, why does human nature consistently gravitate toward these man-made rules and systems of secret knowledge rather than just resting in the grace of the gospel? Why do we want the checklist so badly?
We want the checklist because the checklist gives us a metric for human pride.
A metric for pride. Okay, unpack that.
If salvation or spiritual elite status or even total wellness depends on my ability to maintain a pristine diet or endure an ice bath longer than you, or fast for 40 days, or achieve a mystical vision, then I can boast about my achievements.
I have a scoreboard.
Exactly. You have a scoreboard. You can look down on the uninitiated masses who haven't reached your level of enlightenment.
But grace ruins the scoreboard.
Grace shatters the scoreboard entirely. Grace tells the billionaire and the beggar that they are equally bankrupt, that their best moral efforts are filthy rags, and that they must rely entirely on the blood of a crucified Jewish carpenter.
Yeah, the human ego hates grace because grace demands the absolute death of pride.
Spot on. It leaves no room for boasting.
Which brings us to the grammatical structure of Paul's letter. Since man-made rules and asceticism fail to restrain the flesh, Paul has to provide the genuine solution.
And his solution is brilliant.
The sources point out that his solution relies on the theological architecture of how he structured the document. The grammar itself carries the weight of a person's eternal soul.
Yeah, you really cannot understand the commands of Colossians 3 without understanding the theology of Colossians 1 and 2.
The sources highlight a specific pattern here.
They emphasize a pattern Paul uses in almost all of his epistles, which is indicatives before imperatives.
Okay, this is a crucial concept for anyone listening. Explain the mechanics of those two terms. What is an indicative and what is an imperative?
Sure, so an indicative is a statement of reality. It declares a fact. It is not asking you to do anything. It is simply telling you what has already been done.
So it's just stating what is true.
Yes. In chapters 1 and 2 of this letter, Paul establishes the massive theological indicatives. He explains who Christ is as the image of the invisible God, his absolute supremacy over the cosmos, and what he accomplished through the shedding of his blood on the cross.
He's laying the foundation.
Right. Paul declares that believers have already been circumcised without hands, buried with Christ in baptism, and raised with him through faith. That is the indicative reality. The work is finished.
Okay, and then he shifts gears.
Then, in chapters 3 and 4, Paul shifts his grammar. He moves to the imperatives. An imperative is a command. It is the instruction for how believers must behave.
So the grammar of biblical ethics is always gospel first, gracious command second.
Always. And the transition between those two halves of the letter hinges on one specific word in the Greek text.
Yes, the Greek inferential conjunction out, which translates to therefore.
That's the word.
Yeah.
Colossians 3.5 begins, Put to death, therefore. That single conjunction is the bridge.
It connects the violent command to kill sin directly back to the preceding verses.
Right, the verses which state, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God."
Let me make sure I am grasping the causality here, because this is huge. You do not kill sin to earn a union with Christ. You kill sin because you are already united to him.
That is the core of Reformed theology right there.
Yeah.
The ethics must always be rooted in redemptive theology.
Because if you reverse the order,
If you reverse the order, you destroy the gospel entirely. The sources show how this grammatical structure dismantles two massive, opposing theological errors that have plagued the church for centuries.
legalism and antinomianism. Let's define the psychological traps of both of those errors. Start with legalism.
Okay, legalism tells the soul that your obedience earns your acceptance with God. It operates on a contract.
A transactional relationship.
Exactly. It says, if I obey these rules, if I avoid these behaviors, then God is obligated to love me and bless me. It places the burden of salvation squarely on human performance.
And on the flip side, you have antinomianism.
Right, which literally translates to against the law. Antinomianism looks at grace and draws a terribly distorted conclusion.
It abuses grace.
It tells the soul that because we are saved by grace, obedience is basically unnecessary. It turns the grace of God into a license for sensuality. It says, I am forgiven, so it does not matter how I live.
I want to try an analogy here to see if it captures the mechanics of this indicative and imperative dynamic.
Go for it.
Imagine a trauma hospital. Legalism is a doctor walking into the morgue, standing over a dead body and saying, if you get up, run a mile, and eat a healthy diet, I will give you a heartbeat.
That's a grim picture, but yeah.
It demands the action to earn the life, which is impossible for a corpse. Now, antinomianism is a doctor walking up to a patient who has just received a miraculous, life-saving heart transplant and saying, you have a new heart now. You're totally cured. So just lie in this hospital bed for the rest of your life, eat junk food, and never move your muscles.
It's completely absurd.
Right. The new heart was given so the person could live a vibrant life. But Paul's grammar, the indicative followed by the imperative, is the true gospel. The divine surgeon takes out the heart of stone, implants a heart of flesh, breathes life into the lungs, and then says, therefore, because you are alive, get out of this bed and start walking.
That captures the causality perfectly. You are commanding a living person to act in accordance with their new nature. You are not telling a corpse to walk. You are telling a resurrected man to stop wearing his grave clothes.
But I have to push back on this from a lived experience perspective. The tension between the indicative and the imperative creates immense daily friction.
It really does. It's a battle.
Because if I am a believer, Paul says, you have died to sin. That is the indicative reality. But then he says, put sin to death. If it is already dead, why am I killing it?
It's a paradox, right?
Yeah. How do you reconcile the fact that a believer is totally justified and united to Christ, yet still desires to engage in the very sins Paul lists here?
You are hitting on the tension of the already and the not yet.
The already and the not yet.
Yeah. To use a modern technological analogy, think of computer system.
Okay, I'm with you.
The moment you are united to Christ, your core operating system is completely replaced. The old OS is wiped out, the new OS is installed. You are a new creation.
So the core is fixed.
Yes, but there are still thousands of corrupted files, legacy malware, and old viruses stored on the hard drive from the previous system.
Ah, I see.
The new operating system has to actively locate, quarantine, and delete those corrupt files. The malware is no longer in charge of the computer, but it is still present and is trying to execute its old code.
That makes total sense.
When Paul says you have died, he means the dominion and the ruling authority of the old nature is broken. But when he says put to death, he means you must actively hunt down the remnants of that old malware and execute it.
Which takes us directly into what the sources refer to as the graveyard.
The graveyard, yes.
Because the believer possesses this new operating system, they have to deal ruthlessly with the rotting remnants of their old life. We are looking at verses 5 through 7, where Paul shifts into aggressive, violent language.
He really does. He does not use therapeutic language here at all. The Greek verb he uses in verse 5 is necessitates. It translates to put to death, execute, or mortify.
Mortification is not a word we use often today. It sounds, I don't know, medieval.
It sounds violent because the nature of sin is violent. Grammatically, necessitates is an aorist active imperative.
And what does that tense mean in Greek?
The aorist tense in the imperative mood denotes an action with a sense of urgency, decisiveness, and finality. Paul is not advising the Colossian church to merely manage their flaws.
He's not telling them to put their sin in a timeout.
No, he is not telling them to negotiate with their lusts or put their sin on a leash or send their covetousness to therapy. He is demanding a slaughter.
Wow.
The source is, quote, the 17th century Puritan theologian John Owen, who wrote an entire treatise on this concept. Owen famously stated, "Be killing sin or it will be killing you."
Be killing sin or it will be killing you. That frames sin as an active predator.
It is absolutely a predator.
It is not just a bad habit. It is something trying to destroy your soul. So what exactly is on the execution block in these verses? What is the malware we have to delete?
Paul provides a five-fold list of sensual, fleshly sins. He begins with porneia.
Which is where we get the word pornography, right?
Exactly. It is a broad Greek term that covers all forms of sexual immorality outside the covenant of marriage. Every sexual deviation from the Creator's design falls under this word.
Okay, what's next?
Then he lists impurity, which refers to moral uncleanness, often the thoughts and intentions that lead to porneia. Next is passion, which in this context means a degrading, uncontrollable physical appetite.
Like being driven entirely by your base urges.
Yes. Then evil desire, the fundamental craving for forbidden things. And finally, the climax of the list, which is covetousness.
I want to spend a significant amount of time on that last one because covetousness is fascinating here. The text explicitly labels covetousness as idolatry.
It does, very clearly.
Why does Paul make that connection? Because usually when we hear the word idolatry, we think of ancient people bowing down to a carved wooden statue or a golden calf in the desert.
We think of literal idols.
Right. We do not naturally associate wanting a neighbor's car or desiring a higher salary or craving social status with idolatry.
We fail to associate it because we misunderstand what worship actually is. Covetousness is fundamentally a worship disorder.
A worship disorder. I like that phrasing.
The lust for more, whether it is an insatiable drive for money, power, physical pleasure, or societal validation, is an internal demand that the created thing take the place of the Creator.
So you are elevating a thing above God.
Precisely. When a human heart is covetous, it is essentially looking at that object of desire and saying, "You are my life. I need you to feel secure. I need you to have value. I cannot be happy unless I possess you."
And that is a direct rival to Christ.
Yes, because Paul has already established in verse 4 of this chapter that Christ is the believer's life. Therefore, covetousness is a direct, treasonous rivalry against Christ. It strips God of his rightful place as the supreme provider and satisfier and enthrones a temporary, created object in his place.
That reframes the entire concept of ambition in our modern society. I mean, we have normalized covetousness to an alarming degree.
It's the water we swim in.
In many ways, it is the fundamental engine of Western capitalism. The entire advertising industry is built on cultivating covetousness.
Convincing you that you lack something essential for your happiness.
Right, and that purchasing their product will fill that void. We call it drive or hustle. We reward it, but Paul calls it idolatry.
He calls it what it is.
And he follows this list with a sobering, terrifying warning in verse 6. He says that on account of these things, the wrath of God is coming.
And the sources are adamant that the modern church cannot afford to soften, redefine, or skip over the wrath of God.
People definitely want to skip over it.
They do. But the wrath of God is not an unhinged, emotional temper tantrum. It is his settled, holy, and perfectly just opposition to evil.
It is a righteous anger.
Yes. The warning in verse 6 is necessary because professing believers can easily become numb to the gravity of their own sin. They start to think of their greed or their lust as minor personality quirks.
Just a little flaw.
Right. But Paul reminds them that the eschatological wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, specifically because of these sensual sins and these hidden idolatries.
And to demonstrate how heavily infected the modern church is by these ancient plagues, the sources bring in some staggering data from the Barna Group.
The statistics are heartbreaking.
I'm going to report this impartially, as the sources present it. They state that 75% of Christian men and 40% of Christian women actively engage with pornography at some level.
Inside the church.
Yes. We are not talking about secular society. We are talking about individuals sitting in the pews, partaking in communion, and claiming union with Christ.
Those numbers represent a catastrophic failure to execute the command of verse 5.
It's a failure to mortify.
Exactly. They prove that the heavy Greco-Roman cultural pressures of sexual immorality that the ancient Colossians faced are the exact same pressures ravaging the modern conscience.
It hasn't changed.
Not at all. Our society may rebrand these behaviors as personal freedom or sexual liberation or natural appetites, but the apostolic text defines them as earthly, idolatrous, and worthy of divine judgment.
What really stands out to me here is the psychological progression in Paul's list. He does not just throw 5 random sins together.
No, there is a clear order to it.
He moves from outward, visible actions down into invisible, internal cravings. He starts with porneia, which is the physical act of sexual immorality. Then he moves to impurity and passion, which are the internal drives. And he finally lands on covetousness, the foundational idol of the heart.
He's drilling down.
He is tracking the sin backward to its origin. It is like tracing a hacker's IP address through a dozen dummy servers until you finally locate the master computer.
That is the diagnostic genius of biblical counseling right there. External behavior is always the fruit. The internal affection is the root.
Fruit and root.
If an individual is engaging in outward sexual immorality or aggressive corporate greed, that behavior did not materialize out of thin air. It sprouted from a secret desire, an evil passion.
And that passion came from somewhere too.
Yes, it grew from a foundational belief that God is not sufficient to provide joy, which is the definition of covetousness. If you only attempt to modify the outward behavior without locating the idolatrous belief feeding it, you will fail.
Because it's just behavior modification.
Exactly. The behavior will just mutate and reappear somewhere else. You have to trace the outward action back down to the dark soil of the heart and execute the idol you find buried there.
Locate the idol and execute it. That is the daily warfare of the believer. But the text does not stop at internal desires, because internal idolatry inevitably breeds external relational fracture.
Sin always bleeds onto other people.
Always. A heart obsessed with itself will naturally destroy the people around it, so the execution of hidden lust must be followed by the stripping away of social hostility. Let's look at the next progression in verses 8 through 11.
Paul shifts his metaphor here. He moves from the violent language of the executioner to the language of the wardrobe.
The wardrobe.
The governing verb changes to an aorist middle imperative, which is apophist. This literally means to put away or to strip off, evoking the imagery of taking off filthy, rotting, foul-smelling garments.
So what are the filthy garments we are commanded to strip off?
He provides a second, 5-fold list, this time targeting the sins of the tongue and the temper. He begins with orga, which is a deep-seated, smoldering anger.
Smoldering anger.
Yes, is the resentment that you nurse over time. Then he lists thymos, which is sudden, explosive outbursts of wrath.
Let's pause on those 2 words because they manifest so differently in real life.
Very differently.
Orga is the passive-aggressive text message, the silent treatment, the quiet plotting against a coworker. But thymos is the screaming match in the parking lot, the sudden loss of control. Both are destructive, but they operate on different fuses.
Spot on. And he follows those with malice, which is the deliberate evil disposition that actually wishes harm or ruin upon someone else.
That's a dark one.
It is. Then slander, which is using speech to destroy another person's reputation. And finally, obscene talk and lying to one another.
It seems incredibly easy for modern churchgoers to vehemently condemn the sensual sins from the previous list, the sexual immorality and the passion, while completely tolerating or even defending the social sins in this second list.
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight the sheer hypocrisy of a church culture that demands theological orthodoxy, but tolerates malice among its members.
It's rampant.
A man might boast about having perfectly sound doctrine. He might be able to articulate the nuances of justification, but he cuts his wife and children to pieces with cruel, impatient speech.
Or the flip side.
Right. A woman might pride herself on her moral purity, but she uses it as a cloak to slander and gossip about her brothers and sisters in the faith. Paul is making it clear that the tongue reveals the unmortified flesh just as surely as the body does.
Obscene speech, uncontrolled temper, and lying are entirely incompatible with the God of truth.
You cannot claim the new hardware while running the old malicious software.
And what is the theological reasoning for stripping off these social sins? Why do we have to stop lying to one another?
The reasoning is grounded in the indicative reality found in verses 9 and 10. Believers must stop lying because they have put off the old Adam, the old self, and have put on the new man.
The new creation.
Yes. This new man is undergoing a continuous, ongoing renewal. The Greek word is anakainumenon, in true knowledge, after the image of the Creator.
The word anakeinumenon suggests a process.
It is a process, yes.
It is not an instant perfection. It is a total reconstruction of human identity over time.
Exactly. Sin defaced the image of God in humanity. It marred the original design. But Christ, who is the perfect image of the invisible God, is actively restoring and renewing his people. You strip off the old garments of anger and slander because they literally do not fit your new nature. They belong to a dead man.
And this new nature obliterates all the old earthly categories we use to divide and elevate ourselves. I really want to look closely at verse 11 because it outlines a radical societal shift that would have sounded like madness to the ancient world.
It was a bombshell text.
Paul says that in this new humanity, there is no Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free.
To the first century ear, that list was explosive. It dismantles every conceivable human boundary.
He hits them all.
He pairs ethnic divisions, Greek and Jew, religious divisions, circumcised and uncircumcised, cultural divisions, barbarian and Scythian, and economic class divisions, slave and free.
Most listeners might not grasp the weight of the word Scythian in this list. Who are the Scythians and why is their inclusion here so radical?
So the Scythians were nomadic tribes from the Eurasian steppes. To the civilized Greco-Roman world, the Scythians were considered the absolute bottom of the evolutionary barrel.
Just total savages in their eyes.
Right. Ancient historians like Herodotus described them as bloodthirsty savages who drank the blood of their enemies and used their scalps as napkins.
Wow.
The Greeks used the word Scythian as the ultimate insult for someone entirely devoid of culture or civilization. Yet Paul declares that in Christ, a Scythian stands on the exact same level ground as a highly educated, wealthy, philosophically trained Greek. All of those earthly, tribal categories lose their defining authority.
Now, I need to impartially report on a claim made in the source material regarding this verse and modern sociological frameworks.
Okay, let's hear it.
The sources assert that this specific text completely dismantles the core tenets of critical race theory and intersectionality. According to the sources, those modern frameworks seek to divide people into distinct camps of oppressors and oppressed, assigning fundamental identity and moral value based on lines of race, historical class, and social standing.
Right.
But the sources argue that Paul is completely rejecting that worldview by stating that true identity in the church is exclusively defined by the phrase at the end of verse 11, Christ is all and in all. The sources claim this means our core identity must be rooted in Christ alone, not in our fleshly heritage, our skin color, or our societal status.
That is the theological and sociological argument the sources present. By declaring that Christ is all and in all, Paul is establishing that Christ is the sum, the center, and the defining reality of the new community.
It is a totally new basis for identity.
Yes. It does not mean those earthly distinctions evaporate in the physical world. A slave still had to work, a Greek still spoke Greek, but it means those distinctions hold absolutely zero weight in determining one's spiritual standing, value, or authority within the new creation.
I am trying to envision the staggering social dynamic of this letter actually being read aloud for the very first time. Imagine a house church gathered in Colossae.
Picture the room.
Right. On one side of the small room, you have Philemon, who was a wealthy slave owner and an influential member of that specific city. And standing in the very same room is Onesimus, who was Philemon's runaway slave.
A man who had likely stolen from him.
Yeah, a runaway who had stolen from him, but who had recently been converted under Paul's ministry in Rome and sent back. They are listening to this letter being read together. How does a text like this force a total reevaluation of how they view one another?
It shatters the worldly hierarchy completely. Philemon cannot look at Onesimus and say, "You are merely my property. I hold superior status."
Because Christ is all and in all.
Exactly. And Onesimus cannot look at Philemon merely as an earthly oppressor to be hated. When they hear the words, "Here there is not slave or free," they are forced to recognize each other as brothers. They have to partake in the bread and the wine at the same table.
The old garments of malice and societal superiority have to be stripped off.
It forces us today to look at the people sitting across the aisle from us. In the pews, people of different ethnicities, different political affiliations, different tax brackets, and acknowledge that if Christ is their life and Christ is my life, then we share a bond that is infinitely thicker than anything the world uses to divide us.
It is a completely different way of existing. It defies tribalism. Which leads us to the next phase of Paul's instruction. because having stripped off the rotting garments of the old creation, the believer cannot just remain unclothed in a moral vacuum.
Right, you can't be spiritually naked.
They have to dress according to their new citizenship. Let's examine verses 12 through 14.
Paul begins verse 12 by reminding them of their supreme identity. He addresses them as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved.
That immediately brings up the doctrine of election. Unconditional election is a concept that causes a lot of friction for people. How does Paul use it here?
Often, people view the doctrine of unconditional election as a cold, abstract, philosophical puzzle, or even worse, as a justification for spiritual laziness.
Like, I'm chosen, so I don't have to do anything.
Right. They think, if God chose me before the foundation of the world, I do not have to put any effort into my sanctification. But Paul uses election as the supreme motivation for holy living.
He flips it.
He totally flips it. He does not say, clothe yourselves with these virtues so that God might eventually notice you, choose you, and love you. That is legalism.
We talked about that earlier.
Right. Instead, he says, because you are already chosen, set apart, and deeply loved by God despite your total depravity, dress like it. Bear the family likeness. The ethical action flows directly from the absolute security of the divine identity.
So what are the specific garments of grace we are commanded to put on?
Paul provides a fivefold catalog of virtues to contrast the fivefold lists of sins. First, sponchna termo, which literally translates to bowels of compassion.
Bowels of compassion, that's a very physical description.
The ancients viewed the bowels, the gut, as the seat of deep emotion. It points to a deep, visceral affection for others. It is feeling the misery of another person in your own stomach.
Like a gut-wrenching empathy.
Yes. Second is kindness, which is a sweet disposition that actually takes action for another's good. Third is humility, the conscious refusal of self-exaltation. Fourth is meekness. And fifth is patience, the ability to endure provocation, annoyance, and mistreatment without retaliating.
I really want to challenge a massive cultural assumption regarding that fourth virtue. Meekness.
Oh, meekness is so misunderstood.
It is. In our hyper-competitive modern Western culture, meekness is almost universally equated with weakness. It is seen as being a doormat, letting people walk all over you, lacking a spine. How do the sources redefine and reframe meekness for us?
The sources clarify that biblical meekness is the exact opposite of weakness. It is immense strength, submitted entirely to divine control.
Immense strength under control.
Let me use an analogy. Think of a nuclear reactor. Inside the core, you have a staggering, almost incomprehensible amount of heat and energy. If that energy is uncontrolled, if the core is exposed, you have a catastrophic meltdown that destroys everything around it.
Just total destruction.
Right. That uncontrolled meltdown is the sin of thymos, the explosive wrath we talked about earlier. But a functional nuclear reactor uses graphite control rods. These rods are inserted into the core to absorb the neutrons and regulate the reaction.
So the power is still there.
The energy is still there. It is still immensely powerful, but it is harnessed, controlled, and submitted to a design, allowing it to provide light and power to an entire city.
That is a brilliant reframing.
Meekness is the control rod. It is having the capacity to retaliate, having the intellectual or physical strength to crush an opponent, but choosing to restrain that force out of submission to God's providence.
Meekness is strength under control. It is the restraint of power, not the absence of it. And we really need that restrained strength for the specific action Paul commands next in verse 13.
Yes, the action of dealing with other people.
He uses participial phrases to dictate how these virtues actually function when two sinners bump into each other in the real world. He says we must be bearing with one another and forgiving each other.
The Greek word for forgiving here is charismanoi. It is derived from the root word charis, which means grace. So Paul is literally telling us to grace one another.
Grace one another.
And he sets an absolute unyielding standard for this action. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that standard. How does using Christ's atonement as the baseline for interpersonal forgiveness totally alter the way a congregation handles daily grievances? Because human forgiveness usually comes with a whole lot of fine print.
It alters it completely because it removes our right to set our own terms for forgiveness.
So say more about that.
In the flesh, if I base my forgiveness on how sorry the other person is, or how much they have compensated me for the offense, or how much they grovel, my forgiveness will always be shallow, delayed, and conditional. I remain the judge.
You hold all the cards.
Right. But Paul commands us to look at the Lord's forgiveness. How did the Lord forgive you? Did he wait for you to perfectly compensate him for your rebellion?
No.
No. He forgave an immeasurable debt of cosmic treason. He absorbed the cost himself through the shedding of his own blood on the cross. He paid the debt you owed.
So when a congregation uses the cross as the baseline,
They realize that holding a bitter grudge against a fellow believer is supreme hypocrisy. It is functionally denying the magnitude of the grace you yourself received. In the parable of the unforgiving servant, Jesus makes it clear. You cannot be forgiven a 10,000 talent debt by the king and then choke your fellow servant over a $20 debt. You grace others because you have been radically and possibly graced.
and what is the capstone to all of this? What holds this new wardrobe together so it doesn't just fall apart when tested?
Verse 14 says, "And above all these put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." The Greek word is agape.
So love is like the overcoat.
Love is the overcoat. It is the ligament that unites all the other virtues. Without agape love, your humility can easily mutate into self-pity. Your patience can become passive aggression. Your kindness can become manipulative. Love is the covenantal bond that seeks the highest spiritual good of the brethren before God.
So we have walked through the graveyard of mortification. We have stripped off the filthy rags of malice and anger, and we have put on the new wardrobe of compassion, meekness, and forgiving love.
It's a total overhaul.
It is, which naturally brings up the question of execution. We are looking at this overwhelming list of commands: kill your secret sins, stop lying, forgive everyone who wrongs you exactly as Christ forgave you. If I am listening to this, I am thinking, how is any of this actually possible?
Where did the strength come from?
Yeah, where do we find the capacity to execute this without just collapsing under the weight of the demands?
If you try to accomplish this list through sheer human willpower, you will end up in one of two places. You will either collapse into total despair because you realize you cannot do it, or you will morph into a self-righteous Pharisee, pretending you have done it while hiding your secret sins.
Both are terrible options.
Right. The entire passage points directly away from human effort and points to the Savior. The mortification of sin and the cultivation of virtue are only possible because of the believer's spiritual union with Christ.
Break down how Christ fulfills the specific demands of this passage in all of his offices.
The sources outline this beautifully using the historic threefold office of Christ: prophet, priest, and king.
Let's start with prophet.
As our prophet, Christ sets the absolute standard of divine truth. His word, acting like a two-edged sword, exposes the hidden idolatry, the covetousness, and the anger that we try to justify. He reveals the diagnosis.
He shows us the X-ray?
Yes. As our priest, he shed his own blood to absorb the terrifying wrath of God mentioned back in verse 6. He satisfied divine justice perfectly so that we are no longer under condemnation. He cleanses us from the porneia and malice.
And as king?
As our king, he commands the absolute allegiance of our hearts. He demands that we execute the remnants of the old kingdom operating within us, and he supplies the Spirit to actually accomplish it.
The sources also draw a fascinating theological contrast between the first Adam and the last Adam regarding this passage. Can you explain that connection and the mechanics of federal headship?
Yes. Federal headship is the idea that a single representative acts on behalf of an entire group.
Okay.
The first Adam, the historical Adam in the Garden of Eden, was our first representative. When he rebelled against God, he plunged all of humanity into the sins of verses 5 and 8. Because of his failure, we are born into a state of total depravity, naturally inclined toward covetousness, anger, and lying.
We inherit his nature.
We wear the filthy, rotting rags of the first Adam. But Christ comes as the last Adam. He is the perfect image of the invisible God. He obeyed the law perfectly where Adam disobeyed. He resisted the temptation of the devil where mankind fell.
He succeeded where Adam failed.
Entirely. And as the last Adam, he credits his perfect righteousness to the believers while taking their sin upon himself. Because we are united to the last Adam, we are given the capacity to actually put on the virtues of verses 12 through 14. We are transferring our lineage from the bankrupt estate of the first Adam to the victorious infinite wealth of the last Adam.
That is such a clarifying theological lens. Let
Yeah.
me summarize the entire movement of the text as we have analyzed it. Paul drags the reader out of the comfortable therapeutic illusions of modern culture.
He wakes us up.
He really does. He takes us into the graveyard and hands us a sword, commanding us to ruthlessly execute our secret sensual sins. Then he pulls us out of the graveyard and tells us to strip off the filthy garments of our anger, malice, and lying.
And then comes the new clothing.
Right. Finally, he leads us into the wardrobe of the new creation, wrapping us in the heavy royal garments of compassion, meekness, and forgiving love. And the entire progression is only made possible by the blood of the cross.
That is the exact trajectory of the passage.
Mm.
And it leaves us with immense, tangible, practical applications for the church today.
Let's summarize those direct applications drawn by the sources. How does this hit the ground on a Tuesday morning?
First, there is the absolute necessity for believers to declare total, unyielding war on secret sins. You cannot claim union with Christ while comfortably harboring a secret habit of pornography or nursing a hidden, bitter grudge against a family member.
The malware has to be deleted.
It has to go. Second, there is the call for Christian households to model this self-sacrificing love and gentle spirit. Husbands, wives, and children must interact through the lens of grace, not the harsh, explosive wrath of the flesh.
And the third application.
Third, the absolute refusal to hold grudges within the church body. The standard of forgiveness is the cross. Therefore, willful unforgiveness is rebellion against the king.
And there is one final catalyst for purity mentioned in the sources that we really need to touch on. It is the anticipation of Christ's return.
Yes, back in verse 4, Paul promises that when Christ appears, believers will appear with him in glory.
So looking forward changes how we act right now.
The sources tie this to the blessed hope of Christ's premillennial return. The realization that Christ could split the sky at any moment, that the King is returning to judge the living and the dead, serves as the ultimate catalyst for purity today.
It creates an urgency.
You do not want to be found sleeping in the filthy garments of the old creation when the Lord of glory arrives. Eschatology fuels ethics.
That is a staggering reality to keep front and center in our minds. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to where we started. We opened by talking about how much we like a clear medical diagnosis, like an X-ray showing a broken bone.
We want a clean binary solution.
What the Apostle Paul has done in Colossians 3 is hand us the ultimate spiritual X-ray. He cuts through the murky, therapeutic, muddy waters of our modern culture. He doesn't offer a bandage for our self-esteem. He demands a surgical strike against our depravity.
He identifies the disease, precisely idolatry and fleshly corruption. And he points us to the only cure, which is our union with the crucified and risen Christ.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to sit with long after this audio ends. It builds on what we discussed earlier. When the thing we are secretly worshiping is at risk of being taken away from us, we lash out with the malice, the orge, and the thymos described in verse 8.
The wrath comes out when the idol is touched.
Exactly. So I want you to ask yourself, what is your greatest source of frustration right now? What is the specific thing making you the most angry, the most anxious, or the most bitter? Look closely at that frustration. Trace it backward to its root, because it might just reveal what you are secretly worshiping instead of Christ. Let that question linger. Thank you for joining us at the table today on Reformed Thinking.